is a graduate of Western Michigan University and has devoted the past 15 years of her professional career to higher education, serving as an academic counselor for 7 years at the University of Phoenix and currently as a financial aid counselor with Kent State University. Mrs. Napier is a woman of many talents. She has preserved the family heritage, having been the owner-operator of a clothing design and dressmaking shop for numerous years. Mr. Lambert was a tailor. She is a wife, mother, and grandmother, and is also a public speaker, proponent for civil rights issues, event planner, writer, and award-winning poet. Her current project is in the final stages, a children's book titled Codename Midnight. Remember that word? The William Lambert story. Mrs. Napier's objective is to bring to life the heroic story of William Lambert and his contributions to Detroit and the Underground Railroad. So we will hear from that great man's great-great-great-granddaughter.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I want to thank you for your attendance of this session, as my esteemed previous speakers have brought the story of my ancestor to life and shared his historical significance he has to Detroit and to the state of Michigan. My intent is to share William Lambert from an ancestor's point of view. My name is Christina STREETY Napier, as she has already mentioned, and I am the third great-granddaughter of William Lambert of the Underground Railroad fame. Today, I plan to cover my personal connection to William Lambert, William Lambert the man and his character, his importance and correlation to Detroit, his role in the Underground Railroad, his involvement in the Men of Oppression Vigilant Organization. William married Julia Riddle and had 5 living children that my mother spoke of. However, according to further research, he also had other children that appeared in earlier censuses, but not in others. His living descendants don't have any photos or evidence. Only thing we have about that is according to public record to substantiate the exact number of children that he actually had. Most of the Lambert children had the same drive and passion as their father, having a measure of success themselves. Crummell was a noted author and poet who was personally acquainted with Oliver Wendell Holmes and Harry Wadsworth. Toussaint, named after Toussaint L'Ouverture, was an accomplished musician playing in concerts in many of the Detroit area churches and was the first African-American letter carrier in the city of Detroit. Benjamin was a noteworthy painter and followed in his father's passion for civil rights issues and was instrumental in establishing the NAACP chapter here in Detroit in 1912. William's daughters were also successful during a time in which female contributions were not always esteemed. Ella followed in her father's footsteps and was a talented dressmaker as well. Harriet was my great-great-grandmother. Along with her sister Ella, they were instrumental in starting the original Willing Workers, which is an organization that was established to meet the financial and emotional needs of poverty-stricken African-American families. This organization is still in operation today. My mother was an active member, as was I for a time when I lived here in Detroit. Harriet was the eldest daughter. She married Samuel J. Williams of Mississippi and had 2 sons and 2 daughters. One of her daughters, Eudora, was my great-grandmother. She married Zach Simons of Ontario, Canada. Eudora had 1 daughter and 3 sons, one of which was my grandfather, Perry Simons. Perry grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and attended U of M to study dentistry. Harry had 2 children, one of which was my mother, Lois Simon Streety. My mother, Lois, was a devoted community and civic volunteer and also a dedicated educator in the city of Romulus, Michigan. This brings the family tree to me. Pictured with my ancestor, William Lambert, in a photo that was used for a story in a local magazine article. The other photos are of my 3 daughters and my 3 granddaughters. Education has remained a family value. As one of my daughters, the eldest, is a nurse. My middle daughter is a social worker, and my youngest is studying to become a pharmacist. You ask, who is William Lambert? Well, I'm going to tell you. Some of you may have heard some of the stories about him, but I'm going to tell it from the family stories that we've always known about him. William was born in Trenton, New Jersey as a free man during pre-Civil War days. His mother was a free woman and his father was a slave who had purchased his own freedom. I'm still attempting to try to locate additional information. I may have to go back to New Jersey, etc., to try to find more information about William's parents and whether or not he had siblings. That information I'm still kind of in the research and try to find further connections for that. As a child, William exhibited a high level of intelligence and was educated at Quaker schools. The climate for counties that bordered slave states at that time was becoming more and more hostile, and people of color began to settle in Canada. It's about that time that William decided to go with his schoolmaster and accompany him on a trip to Canada. But once they reached Buffalo, William stayed back and his professor went on to Toronto. But William passed the time hanging around the lake shores. When his schoolmaster returned, William had hired aboard a vessel as a cabin boy. Once he reached Detroit and he was weary of travel, he had been on the boat for a long time, he decided to explore the city and he remained here for a little while as a youth. Once seeing Detroit, William was intrigued and he was determined that one day to return to Detroit to live. A couple years passed before William returned. It was during that time that he became very interested in abolitionist activities. William returned to Detroit within 3 years and had become one of the principal conductors on the Underground Railroad and a proponent for civil liberties for people of color. William owned a modest home near downtown Detroit, shown here. He also owned and operated a thriving tailor shop in downtown Detroit on East Jefferson. His entrepreneurship and business savvy allowed him to become one of the wealthiest African Americans in the state of Michigan at that time. A proponent for education, he helped to set up classrooms in the church and later pushed to have public schools set up to educate Black children, knowing that their education was a catalyst to overcome poverty. His dedication and conviction concerning education is a family legacy, as I said before, that still lives on. As I mentioned earlier, William was a family man who was an active member of the historic Second Baptist Church, which was a safe haven for the Underground Railroad station in the heart of what is now Detroit's Greektown. He served there for many years before becoming one of the founders of St. Matthew's Church, and he was the primary backer, helping to finance the construction, and served as one of its wardens until his death. And this is a picture of the historic church. This slide shows the original church and its structure, and this church was used for more than just religious services. It was home to many Underground Railroad activities and meetings, and it was a place for cultural and civic programs. St. Matthew later merged with St. Joseph's Church on Woodward, and it still stands today. William Lambert, voice of the people, Underground Railroad leader. In 1842, William, Elder Monroe, and others met to propose a petition for African Americans to obtain the right to vote. William was responsible for constructing the petition and became the primary spokesperson for the group. William was the secretary of the first state convention of colored citizens of Michigan ever had. He had a skillful argument before the Judiciary Committee of the Michigan State Legislature in support of a resolution asking the word white citizen, as in white only, be stricken from the state constitution. The words he spoke before this assembly were powerful and filled with the strength of his conviction, taking his argument from the Declaration of Independence. Here is an excerpt from his speech, and I quote, "Therefore, we feel ourselves aggrieved that the blessing obtained by the blood and toil of our fathers are not administered as equally to us as to yourselves. We feel that our suffering caused by being deprived of our political rights should call forth the sympathies of the whole human race, but more especially those of yourselves, among whom we dwell, and who are the authors of our calamities. For you have trampled our liberties in the dust, and thus standing with the iron heel of oppression on our heads, you bid us to rise with a level to yourselves. And because we do not rise, you point the finger of scorn and contempt at us and say that we are an inferior race by nature," end quote. These are very powerful words for an African-American man to speak before a Michigan State Legislature in a time when the climate was not that good for African-Americans, I should say. These fearless words, 100 years before the civil rights movement of the 60s, rang out as a loud protest against the injustices of the world. Much like Martin Luther King, William was passionate, outspoken mouthpiece for civil liberties. Truly, the Underground Railroad was the first civil rights movement. William was viewed as the primary African-American spokesperson and leader in the state of Michigan at that time. He was a fearless man, having courage and not taking into account his own safety or that of his family. He stood up for the rights and civil liberties of the downtrodden people. William served as one of the primary conductors and was the treasurer and manager of the Underground Railroad in Detroit, Michigan. Although William's name has not been in the forefront as much as nationally known abolitionists, his role was nevertheless extremely important factor in this movement. William was close and personal friend of John Brown and Frederick Douglass. Douglass was in attendance at many of the planning meetings held in Detroit. Douglass, along with other conductors like DeBaptiste and Webb, often were in the company of men who were in the leaders of the national.